And let's get underway. Yes, welcome to another Raytheon anti-war campaign and Massachusetts peace action webinar. Today we're going to be talking again about Yemen and specifically how for peace in Yemen, the United States government must admit that Saudi has lost this war. And we're joined by Dr. Annelle Sheline, of the Quincy Institute, part of the Middle East program there. She's a research fellow. A little bit of information about us. My name is Brian Garvey. I'm the Assistant Director of Massachusetts Peace Action, largest peace and anti-war organization in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and part of the broader Peace Action Network. And a little bit about the Raytheon anti-war campaign. We are a coalition including lots of great organizations around Massachusetts, including United Against War and Militarism, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Veterans for Peace, of course, Chapter 9, the Smedley Butler Brigade, the Friends Meeting at Cambridge, and many other great organizations that have joined together to fight back against the military-industrial complex in our own backyard. And for us in Massachusetts, that means Raytheon Technologies, one of the largest weapons producers in the world, and an institution that is reaping the profits from the war in Yemen and is also driving it with its massive political influence. But tonight, specifically, we're going to be talking about the UN Security Council resolution from back in 2015 that really sets a false framework for what's going on in Yemen right now and is really keeping the war going. And to explain that, we're honored to be joined by Dr. Annelle Sheline, as I said, a research fellow at the Quincy Institute. And she is also the author of a recent piece in Foreign Policy detailing why this UN Security Resolution 2216 is really contributing to this war continuing. So first of all, I want to thank you, Dr. Sheline, for joining us. Say hello to everyone.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to get to be here with you all, and I just really appreciate all of the super important work that you all are doing on so many fronts. I mean, my focus at the moment is Yemen, but I know you all are working on a lot of different, very crucial issues. So just really appreciate your activism and your ongoing dedication to Yemen and to many other issues.
Thanks. We really appreciate that. That means a lot coming from you. But let's jump right into it. First of all, I wanted you to explain your piece in Foreign Policy. I believe the title of it is that Washington has Yemen policy backwards. Can you explain what you mean by that and give people in the audience who haven't read the piece yet, and we'll be happy to share it with you after this webinar, what's in it and what concerns you about the UN Security Council resolution?
Yeah, so this was a piece I published in Foreign Policy. It came out last month in June. And essentially, I start the piece by pointing out that the position of the United States is to claim to be supporting peace in Yemen, when in fact, the position the United States is taking is actually perpetuating conflict as a result of UN Security Council Resolution 2216, which was passed right after the Saudis launched their military intervention in 2015. And essentially why it's perpetuating conflict is because it requires the Houthis to essentially surrender. So the terms that were passed at the time viewed the Houthis as the primary belligerents and required them to give up all territory they had acquired since 2014 and to give up all of their weapons. And at the time it was passed, it reflected the view of the UN at the time, which was that the Houthis had interrupted this process of transitional justice and an effort to move towards democratic representation that had gotten started following Arab Spring protests in Yemen. And the Gulf Cooperation Council, as well as the UN, had been involved in trying to support this movement towards greater representation in Yemen, such as through the National Security or the National Dialogue Conference, which had brought together many different groups within Yemen to come up with a framework for a new constitution. It was really lauded at the time for including women and including young people. So Yemen had emerged as this success story. After the Arab Spring, they'd managed to get their president to step down after almost a year of protests that were often violent. Many people were killed. But it seemed that Yemen was moving towards a really exciting process of potentially democratic transition. And so when the Houthis essentially rejected the outcome of the National Dialogue Conference and turned to violence in order to pursue their own desired outcome, at the time, the UN really wished to condemn that very strongly. However, unfortunately, what we've seen since then is essentially, as a result of the Saudi-led intervention, absolute devastation in Yemen, the ongoing blockade that the Saudis are carrying out against the Yemeni population, in particular against the Houthi-controlled areas, has pushed the majority of the country to the brink of famine. The UN and groups like the World Food Program have been sounding the alarm about this for years. People are simply continuing to die. The statistic you hear is that during 2021, the estimate is that a child will die approximately every 75 seconds as a result of either lack of food or other results of the blockade. So perhaps lack of medical care or clean water. So essentially, just when the United States says that it is supporting Saudi peace efforts, what it is supporting is Resolution 2216, which requires the Houthis to essentially surrender or to give up their weapons and their territory. And because the Houthis are winning, essentially, they have no incentive to do so. And so what I argue in the piece is that the UN Security Council must impose or must introduce a new resolution to guide the international system, the international community's approach to Yemen, because up to this point, Saudi Arabia continues to use that justification provided by 2216 to continue to fight against the Houthis, to continue to launch airstrikes, and to continue to maintain this blockade, which is also itself legitimized by the UN, which seems a little crazy, but I'm just trying to explain how sort of at the time, it reflected international frustration with the fact that the Houthis had derailed what was supposed to be this exciting transition process. And yet now here we are over 6 years later, and conditions on the ground simply don't reflect that anymore. And it really is long past time for the UN Security Council and the United States to push for a new approach to resolving the conflict. And one other point I'll make there, essentially that the current framework that is being applied in Yemen incentivizes conflict and incentivizes groups to take up weapons, such that we had, for example, the nephew of the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was in charge in the former North Yemen from 1978 until the unification of Yemen in 1990, and then remained in charge until he finally stepped down in 2012. So he had previously fought alongside his uncle against the Houthis, and then joined with the Houthis when his uncle joined them in his attempt to take power back. Politics, Yemen's very complicated, but happy to get into details if people want to hear more about that. But essentially, he has taken up weapons, other groups have taken up weapons because they know that this is the only way for them to have a seat at the table. Whereas we're not seeing adequate efforts to try to include these groups that had been included earlier in the political transition process: women, young people, civil society organizations, Islamist groups, others that have not taken up weapons. And so essentially, I have heard a lot of frustration about groups in Yemen that actually really reject the point that I'm making, because they see it as sort of giving in to the Houthis, essentially that a new UN Security Council resolution would give in to the fact that the Houthis embraced violence. And so I just wanted to make the point that in the framework that I'm calling for the UN to impose or to reframe the international community's approach to Yemen, it is very important that all efforts are made to empower the voices of groups who have not embraced violence, so that the embrace of violence is not further incentivized.
Thanks for that. And just to let everyone know, I put a link to the article in question in the chat, but if it may be behind a paywall for you, but in a follow-up email, including a recording to this program, we'll also include a PDF of that article in Foreign Policy for everyone to read, because it's a very important one. So as you mentioned, this resolution by the UN Security Council was passed in April of 2015. So that is only 1 month after the Saudi-led intervention began in Yemen. Is it your view that when the UN Security Council made that resolution, that they had no idea that the intervention would last as long as it has and have such devastating effects as it has had, now creating the world's worst humanitarian crisis?
Definitely. As I was saying, my understanding of the intention at the time was really to try to signal displeasure with the Houthis, to signal that the UN saw them as behaving illegitimately, and they were trying to quickly get Yemen back on track towards that political transition. Unfortunately, as has often happened in American foreign policy, I think there was a tendency to underestimate the power of nationalism, and also just a long-standing Yemeni frustration with Saudi meddling in Yemen. So for decades, Saudi Arabia has pursued policies to keep Yemen fairly weak and divided. Some of that involved patronage, some of that involved just efforts to sort of play different groups off against each other. And and Yemenis were quite frustrated with this. And so while you have many people within Yemen, including the majority, pretty much all of my own friends in Yemen, reject control by the Houthis. They're not interested in having Houthi rule. They would like to get back to that political transition process that got started after Saleh was finally ousted in 2012. But at the same time, they're more opposed to what the Saudis are doing. The Saudis have caused significantly greater devastation. They have completely decimated Yemen's already very fragile infrastructure. Yemen already suffers from acute water shortages and inadequate food supply. Historically, Yemen had enjoyed a climate that did allow for agriculture, much more so than the rest of the Arabian Peninsula, for example, which is part of why Yemen's population is bigger. It was historically known, and even in Roman times, as Arabia Felix, or Happy Arabia, because it did have monsoon rains and it had access to water, and there are parts of Yemen that remain quite green. But in general, food produced in Yemen is very expensive. And so what we saw in, for example, the 1980s, the vast majority of Yemenis leaving to go work in Saudi Arabia, for example, or elsewhere, other parts of the Gulf that were going through the big boom years in the 70s and the 80s. And as a result, much less attention was devoted to Yemeni agriculture, and instead Yemen began to very significantly rely on food imports, which is part of why the blockade is so extremely devastating. So at the moment, it's not only a blockade on food, which is so devastating. Some food imports are getting in, although they are quite limited in what's even allowed to come in. So that's already just a constraint on Yemen's right to import what it needs and what it wants for its own population. But especially fuel has been the issue in 2021, that we've seen such few fuel ships allowed to enter the Hodeidah port, one of Yemen's main ports, one of Yemen's only ports, or only major international ports that can take large shipments of imports. And as a result, even if there is food or food aid that groups are trying to distribute, there's no fuel to distribute it around the country. You see these huge lines of people. We know that public sector employees in Yemen have not been paid for years, and so you have doctors with no fuel to run the generators because when the generators are required because electricity has been cut, or the lines are down. So there's no fuel, doctors are not being paid. Essentially, the entire healthcare system is completely shutting down in the midst of COVID. Already, Yemen had been hard hit by a cholera outbreak, a devastating, sort of unprecedented level of a cholera outbreak in terms of what we've observed in the contemporary era. So just to get back to the point, that what the Saudis have done is to truly devastate Yemen, whereas the Houthis are not to sugarcoat what they've done. I mean, they adopt policies that tend to be quite misogynistic. In general, they're have committed really horrific human rights abuses, as tends to happen in under conditions of war. But in general, many Yemenis they're going to fight. Some of them are going to fight alongside the Houthis against the Saudis because nationalism, because the Houthis are Yemeni, and although that's not the case for everyone, but there are Yemenis who are fighting alongside the Houthis in order to try to get the Saudis out. And then once that happens, if foreign intervention were to finally stop, then you could have the internal dynamics return to a situation where Yemenis would need to sort of figure out among themselves what is the political system that is going to work for us moving forwards. One more quick note, just in general from scholarly literature on civil wars, we know in general that when there's foreign involvement, civil wars do tend to run much longer. Whereas if a civil war is really just limited to the internal actors, eventually they run out of resources and they have to figure out a way to live together and to resolve their differences politically.
Yeah, and thanks for adding that last point, because I think it's extremely relevant. We've often observed in US foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, but not only there, that our foreign intervention has lengthened, exacerbated, and even in some cases created civil war, which can be which is probably the worst thing that can happen to a country, is civil war. But to talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia, which has been the major intervening force in the war in Yemen, can you talk a little bit about the US-Saudi relationship, and specifically, during the Trump administration, we saw Congress stand up to the president in a bipartisan way on several occasions when it came to war powers and arms sales, to oppose the war in Yemen. And you even saw candidate Joe Biden on the debate stage call Saudi Arabia a pariah state, and saying that if he was made president, that he would stop support for the Saudi war in Yemen. What has changed between then and now? And what do you see as the major differences or lack of difference between Trump policy and Biden policy on Yemen?
Yeah, so it is fairly frustrating the extent to which there had been a lot of optimism that Biden had come out very strongly on the campaign trail. And then subsequently, one of his first foreign policy speeches on February 4th, he declared quite definitively that the US was going to end support for offensive military actions in Yemen, including relevant arms sales. However, there have been subsequent efforts by Congress to ask the Biden administration to define what exactly that means, what are considered relevant arms sales. It's a notorious issue within international relations to kind of define offensive versus defensive weapons. A weapon that was used for defense can be just as easily, or many weapons can often be then pointed at the enemy and used offensively. And so I think a clear reason, or one of the reasons that we saw a shift in Congress, was that there was a lot of frustration about the Trump administration's very close partnership with Saudi Arabia. And we especially saw this after the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. And up to that point, we'd seen this narrative in the United States that hailed Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, as this exciting reformer who was going to let women drive and return Saudi Arabia to moderate Islam. This is my area of focus for my dissertation, was sort of looking at those kinds of narratives and the way that Arab governments have tended to portray themselves as reformers and as sort of embodying so-called moderate Islam, when in fact that often just means being obedient to the ruler and demonizing Islamist political opposition groups. But so we saw a big shift after Khashoggi, and it was actually after that time, even prior to the midterms when the Democrats retook control of the House, that you saw the US end mid-air refueling for Saudi jets, which did reduce the number of bombs they could drop on a single sortie, but didn't really constrain the Saudis' ability to continue to bomb Yemen, because the Yemen and Saudi Arabia border each other and they're able to just fly right over. And so, unfortunately, I think one major difference was this perception that Trump was too close to the Saudis and too willing to sort of give up any kind of American values in exchange for weapons sales to the Saudis. However, we also saw huge numbers of weapon sales under Obama, and we're continuing to see weapon sales move through under Biden. So unfortunately, I think just candidate Biden talked a big game, and now that he's in power, we're not seeing him really stick to the commitments he had made about ending US support for offensive military action. One thing he could do would be to cancel the US contracts. The Saudi, 75% of Saudi's Air Force approximately is US made, and the other 25% or so is UK made. And so if Biden came out very strongly and said, I'm canceling any sort of maintenance or spare parts contracts until Saudi Arabia, you withdraw from Yemen, those planes would be almost immediately grounded. They need new tires every time they take off. And if Biden likewise said to Boris Johnson, look, we really are going to make ending Saudi aggression on Yemen a priority, the UK has already slashed humanitarian funding to Yemen. We know that they're not really interested in they wouldn't go against the United States on this if Biden made sure that it was clear that this was a priority. So in general, it's the military industrial complex. It's the fact that, it's a lot easier to say things on the campaign trail than it is to follow through with them once you're in the White House.
Yes, but one thing that I think makes President Biden a bit vulnerable is how stridently he came out, both on the campaign trail and in that initial foreign policy address on February the 4th, I believe, at the State Department. Activists were, hesitant a little. We're always skeptical, but many were absolutely thrilled with how clear he was in opposing the Saudi war and saying that we were going to end all support for offensive operations. Now, this is a good question. We're going to get to questions from the chat and audience a little bit later, but this is a good one to introduce now. This is from Marcus, who says, would Saudi Arabia be able to continue its involvement in Yemen without US support? So it's really the question, like you said, these F-15s, I think, largely are the workhorse of the Saudi Air Force. How on earth can the administration plausibly say that it's not supporting offensive operations when it's allowing the maintenance of these planes that are then going out and bombing Yemen offensively?
Precisely. I mean, I think what I've heard from the staff of these various congressional offices is that the way that they're currently defining US involvement looked more like the mid-air refueling, where the US military was actively involved. Whereas some of these US military contractors are private companies that have been contracted by the Saudi government to conduct maintenance and provide spare parts for the Saudi Air Force. So if Biden were to move forward and cancel those, which he could do by executive order, that would be a new step. That wouldn't just be telling the US military, that would be really going toe to toe with the military industrial complex and sort of striking at the bottom line of some of these military contractors, these private American companies that have signed contracts to carry out this work. And so it really does get to this question of the distinction between what the US military is doing and what sort of the broader military industrial complex is doing. I'm not familiar with a case, and you would probably know much better than I in terms of other cases outside of Yemen, whether there have been other instances where a US president went in and declared that US military contractors were not going to be allowed to continue their work. So I think that is part of the distinction, or the distinction that at least I'm hearing from staffers on the Hill, who are just questioning whether something like a war powers resolution is in fact called for. I think the rejoinder to that would be essentially that what Saudi Arabia is doing is completely egregious, in particular continuing to carry out the blockade, which is by definition an offensive action. You can't have a defensive blockade. So to the extent that the United States is, for example, continuing to maintain UN Security Council Resolution 2216, we are perpetuating the conflict. To the extent the US is continuing to provide maintenance to Saudi planes, we are perpetuating the conflict and assisting in offensive action. And yet it's not quite at the level of really kinetic action on the ground by US service members. So I think, and just to get to your point, Brian, about the fact that Biden did come out so clearly and use the words, "This war has to end," for example, which, as you said, really some people were really excited at the fact that Biden had made such a clear statement. So the Biden administration has opened themselves up to criticism on this point, and I think they're kind of just hoping that they don't get called out about it. And thus far, unfortunately, what we've seen from Congress is a certain level of hesitancy from people like Ro Khanna, for example, who had previously been involved in the War Powers Resolution that Trump ultimately vetoed. Bernie Sanders had been involved and at the present just isn't seeming to want to push on this issue. Obviously, we're all aware of the vast domestic issues the United States is facing right now, and members of Congress are caught up with that. But in general, I think a war powers resolution is really required in order to draw attention. First of all, to draw attention to the egregiousness of what's happening in Yemen, and the fact the United States continues to aid and abet it. And that other legislative avenues, for example, with the National Defense Authorization Act, and there has been language proposed for the NDAA to end any kind of support, U.S. military support or maintenance or spare parts or any funds going to what the Saudis are doing in Yemen. But the concern on that is during the process of reconciliation, those kinds of amendments tend to drop out. We've observed that in the past on other issues, whereas a war powers resolution would necessitate a floor vote and would, if nothing else, even if the conclusion reached was that the United States is not necessarily that the involvement of the United States doesn't quite reach a threshold. In general, it would be an opportunity for all members of Congress to have to weigh in on the subject, to draw attention to what's happening in Yemen, and and I mean, essentially, it's up to us as the American people to push our representatives to show that we understand that one of the only ways to push the Biden administration on this is through Congress. And if we, their constituents, insist that they continue to draw attention to this and to make a big deal about it, they're going to have to listen to us.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you just said, Dr. Sheline, on war powers. And I have heard from members of Congress and their staffers that they're concerned that what's going on, US support for the Saudi war in Yemen, does not legally fit the definition of hostilities as laid out by the War Powers Act. But because of its privileged nature, as you just mentioned, it really calls the question politically. And because President Biden was so vehemently opposed to the war in Yemen, at least rhetorically, as a candidate and early on in his administration, that this might force the issue and get him to take action and use his leverage on the Saudis in a way that congressional letters or NDAA amendments do not. So in just a moment, my colleague Cole Harrison is going to put in the chat, and we'll send it to you via email as well, a way for you to get in touch with your members of Congress and ask them to do just that, to call the question politically and introduce a war powers resolution. Because the other reason why we support this piece of legislation, not that we would oppose NDAA amendments, but is the urgency. As we know, the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the big military policy bill, for anyone in the audience who doesn't know, will take months and months to negotiate. I believe last year's did not pass until the week between Christmas and New Year's. So it doesn't really meet the urgency of the situation. I think that's another strike against it. The other being that it's unlikely to survive negotiations, amendments specifically on Yemen. And as you mentioned earlier, that figure that a child is now dying every 75 seconds in Yemen due to the effects of this war. I put in the chat, and I'll send it out to everyone as well, every75seconds.org, which documents the evidence behind that. And it also has a counter as well, just to really drive home how real the situation is for the people in Yemen. These are children that we're talking about. The chief of the UN World Food Program has said that 400,000 children could die this year if something doesn't happen. So just another reason why we think that war powers is the best and most immediate option.
Just one note on that: the specific 400,000 figure was just for children under age 5, and in part, focusing on that because those very young children do tend to be particularly susceptible to the effects of malnutrition and starvation. But it's just to know that number is much bigger. In fact, those are just the youngest and the most vulnerable children.
That's a very important clarification, and I really appreciate you making it. I do want to open it up for questions from the audience, but first I just want to let everyone know, again, we are the Raytheon Anti-War Campaign. We're a coalition of groups, and we invite members of the audience to join in our coalition work, to support our advocacy, to plan events like this, and really to do the actual work that will end US involvement in the war in Yemen. So I'd like to invite everyone to our next organizing meeting, which will take place on Monday, July the 12th at 5 p.m. Eastern. And there are also other groups that are springing up. There's one in Arizona, Tucson, Arizona. There's one in Asheville, North Carolina. These groups are popping up to oppose the military-industrial complex right in their home states. So to act locally and affect change globally. But the first question, I want to go to Hayat Imam, who I know has a question. I'm going to put you up on the screen, Hayat, and ask you to unmute yourself and go ahead with your question for Dr. Sheline. You're still on mute.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for this sobering presentation. I have a question beyond this War Powers Act, what else we could be doing and thinking. And I've latched on to your point when you began, which is that on the world stage, obviously Biden is hiding behind the UN resolution and pretending that that's making everything legit. So, and you also said that you were interested or in a new UN resolution. I was wondering if you and your colleagues have thought a little bit about what such a resolution should say, and also whether there's any energy in the UN, for example, through the World Food Program or other UN bodies who are raising the alarm, if there's a way for some energy to proceed towards a resolution that could maybe counteract the previous one.
Yes, thanks. That's a really important point. In particular, your question about what such an updated or a new resolution pertaining to Yemen should say, I think a crucial element of it would be to empower the groups that have not embraced violence to acknowledge the political reality of the territory the Houthis control. This is part of what the US is not currently doing. Although actually since I published my piece in foreign policy, we did get a headline where the US Special Envoy for Yemen, Tim Lenderking, acknowledged the Houthis as a legitimate actor. There was then some contention of, was this new? Had this always been US policy? But in general, it was drawing attention to the fact that the Houthis are a political reality, to an extent that is not at all recognized by 2216. So the point there is just, it is important to acknowledge the realities on the ground, which do include the Houthis, but also crucial to not leave out the agency of women's groups, of youth groups, of civil society groups, of existing political parties, such that they are all brought to the table and in any sort of future political resolution, such that this does not further incentivize violence. Because if the only way to have a seat at the table is to take up arms and force your way to the table violently, we're going to see even more violence. And the really sobering thing about what's happening in Yemen is the concern that as a result of going on, 6 years now since Saudi intervention, but the previous conflict prior to that, Yemeni society is really breaking down, and as we observe in societies dealing with conflict all over the world, the longer conflict goes on, the harder it is for those societies to heal and to come back together. And so it's very important that any kind of future UN Security Council resolution would incentivize inclusion by these nonviolent groups as well. And in particular, knowing that women's involvement in peace processes, it's documented that this tends to lead to more lasting, peaceful solutions than if women are excluded. One interesting thing about Yemen in the UN is that the UK is the pen holder, which means that they have to initiate any kind of action pertaining to Yemen. Another interesting thing is that usually as Americans, we sometimes think of China and Russia as the spoilers in the UN Security Council. But in this case, both China and Russia would likely actively support a new approach to Yemen. The Russians actually abstained from the original vote on 2216. And so we don't actually have to worry about the fact that they might act as spoilers. And again, if we can get the UK on board, as I said, the UK has already slashed funding to Yemen. I think they're ready to kind of wash their hands of it. France might be a potential spoiler, but we know that Macron would like to sell more weapons to the Saudis, and so he may see this as a way to sort of drive a wedge between the Americans and the Saudis. Not that I want to see more weapons, but in general, yeah, I guess I'd rather have the French sell them weapons than Americans continue to sell the bonanza of weapons that we continue to sell to the Saudis. So I hope that answered your question. So in particular, needing to make sure that we're empowering all relevant political groups and not just militant groups, and being aware of what the other permanent members of the UN Security Council, how to make sure we get them on board.
Thanks for that. Appreciate it. I do think that in this case, it does seem like the United States is the spoiler by its continued support of Saudi Arabia, despite what they're doing in Yemen. And just to maybe provide an answer to an earlier question of when spare parts and maintenance was used to ground an air force, I think maybe the best example of that is the Iranian Air Force. After the revolution in 1979, the US stopped selling spare parts to their Air Force, which was largely made up, I believe, of F-14 Tomcats, which turned very expensive $1 million aircraft into large paperweights after a few years. So it can be done. We know how to do it. I think the reason why we're not doing it in this case is because we want to maintain a relationship with Saudi Arabia. Important to note, the United States is the largest exporter of weapons, arms in the world, and the largest importer of arms in the world is, of course, Saudi Arabia. And this gets me to an interesting question in the chat. I believe this was from Roberta. Yes. And I've heard this pushback before. If we do stop sales or maintenance to Saudi Arabia, is there a fear that Russia or China could step in and provide such weapons?
So yeah, that fear is often raised. Essentially, in the short term, it would take decades for any of these militaries, the various U.S. security partners in the Persian Gulf, which are essentially all members of the GCC, as well as Egypt and Jordan and other Middle Eastern countries like Morocco, for example. All of these, the amount of investment that would be required to fully transfer over, for example, to a Russian system would take decades, because it would be a massive amount of resources required. Personally, I am not all that concerned about a lot of these countries adopting a Russian system, because then the Russians would get to deal with the amount of blowback that the US is currently dealing with when it's American weapons that are fired on vulnerable, helpless populations, American drones, American bombs, American tear gas canisters. If the Russians want to invite that kind of blowback, or the Chinese want to invite that kind of blowback, go for it. I think in general, the United States economy needs to stop relying on the military-industrial complex as a large, and what's frustrating is it's not even that large of a driver of economic growth. So I believe we'd had Bill Hartung on the call who could offer much more detailed analysis on this. This is his area of specialization. As I imagine there are other folks on the call as well who are more deeply grounded in this. But the point just being that investment, for example, in education or in green energy, renewable energies, in the pharmaceutical industry, there are all kinds of other industries where $1 of investment yields much more significant growth in terms of jobs, in terms of future economic prospects. Whereas continuing to invest in the defense industry, in the military-industrial complex, does not yield as many jobs, does not yield as much sort of growth for the American economy in the future. And so this notion that, well, we can't let China start producing the weapons for the world, I think just fundamentally misunderstands that the United States doesn't actually benefit that much from being the global arms supplier to the rest of the world. Who benefits are these massively powerful weapons producers and their corporate leaders and their shareholders, but it does not in fact help Americans. And in general, it actually makes Americans more insecure because we are seen as this global source of instability, of violence, of support for dictatorship around the world. And furthermore, I think both China and Russia have observed the trouble that this has brought back to the United States. I mean, much of what China is trying to do around the world is more about economic investment and trying to expand China's global economic reach, which is already significant, but looking to further expand that. China faces many, many internal domestic issues as its growth starts to slow down. They are desperate to try to keep that growth up. So China is not interested in trying to take on the level of military burden that the United States has saddled ourselves with by having this overinflated notion that we could sort of impose democracy on the rest of the world, and not understanding that when we do that at the point of a gun, we're likely to just invite more violence in response.
Yeah, and I welcome Bill Hartung to join us for comment if you have any. But just to comment myself and to second what you said, we're not talking about changing the caliber of rifle ammunition or something. These weapon systems that we're talking about, fighter jets, attack helicopters, missile systems, defensive and offensive. We're talking about millions and billions of dollars in investment in weapons platforms. They can't just switch over to a Russian or a Chinese system as one flips on and off a light switch. So just to answer that. Next in line, I see Michael Hoey with a hand up. Michael, can you unmute yourself and I'll put you up on screen.
Okay, I was able to unmute myself. My question deals with more of the history of the tension between the different Sunni Muslim factions, like the Islamist versus the Royalist. And then apparently before Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein were killed off, there was kind of a secular grouping, and they seem to have formed blocks, which I guess have hostility. So I don't really understand this, but I do understand what I read, that like Turkey and Qatar are now working with Libyans, and that you have the Gulf Cooperation Council, which are mostly Emirates or Royalists. And then at one time you had guys like Muammar Gaddafi, who were talking about trying to create a new currency standard, that the dollar would no longer be the world's reserve currency, which I think is based on the barrel of oil out of Saudi Arabia. Anyway, there's a lot of players here, a lot of pieces to this puzzle that I don't really know how to put together. So I'm wondering, rather than saying it's a Shiite Sunni issue, I want to understand the difference between the different Sunni factions, and then maybe even Omar, because I understand maybe that Ibadi is even different. So, and that makes them a place where people can negotiate their differences, I guess. So that's what I'm trying to wrap my head around.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, that's that would to probably answer all of the questions wrapped up there would take more time than we have. But I think just quickly, in general, there are often efforts to portray what's happening in the Middle East as just boiling down to sectarianism. And I think it's really important to be very skeptical of that as tending to essentialize conflict and taking them back to these sort of ancient hatreds arguments, when in fact what we've tended to observe is the salience of the Sunni-Shia divide grew much larger, more prominent after the US invasion of Iraq. It had initially, we first saw, especially sort of Saudi Arabia and Iran, highlighting the differences between Sunni and Shia after Iran's Islamic Revolution, when Iran essentially tried to take the mantle of Islamic leadership away from Saudi Arabia and to portray Saudi Arabia as illegitimate because it's a dictatorship, it's autocrats, it's a system of kings, which actually technically the idea of a king is incompatible with very strict interpretations of Islam. So essentially, the Sunni Shia, the salience of the Sunni Shia divide grew much higher after 1979. And then in particular that Iran and Saudi Arabia were really trying to highlight those differences. And then we saw it starting to really play out more in people's lives after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, when then we did see the real breakdown of Sunni Shia communities in Iraq that had historically lived in much more, easy relations with each other. Not that they were perfect, but just that the differences were not so salient. And in the contemporary context, where we're continuing to see Saudi Arabia and Iran viewing each other as their primary rivals and sort of jockeying for position, they are continuing to highlight these differences as really as being more significant than perhaps they would otherwise be. So just to take things back to Yemen, historically in Yemen, you have the former North Yemen, up until 1962, was ruled by a Zaydi imam, or political religious leader. The Zaydis are often described as Shia, but there's some pushback on that because they're actually quite similar to Sunni, partly just due to the fact that there were many other Sunnis around them. To that extent, they are somewhat similar to the Ibadis, who are in Oman primarily. There are a couple of pockets elsewhere in North Africa. And Ibadism is neither Sunni nor Shia, and somewhat similar to the Zaydis, tends to be fairly accommodating of difference, and again because they were surrounded by others who did not share their same belief system. So, however, I do think it's important to point out that the reason that Oman tends to act as a mediator has less to do with, again, this sort of religious essentialism, which is very important to be quite skeptical of, and has a lot more to do with their very independent foreign policy that under Sultan Qaboos, who ruled from 1970 until his death in early 2020, very much resisted Saudi efforts to dominate the GCC, for example. He would go against what the Saudis often were pushing for, or he would just be very careful to pursue a foreign policy that was not seen as sort of too aligned with one side or another. And so this is partly why Oman has been a useful conduit for example, when the JCPOA negotiations were just before they were even started, just sort of the initial efforts to try to get them started, those were facilitated by Oman. We also see the Omanis as the actor that the Houthis consider at present a relatively reliable blocker for them and interact with the rest of the world. Although historically the Qataris had also played that role. So again, not that it's something fundamental about the Omanis, but Kuwait has sometimes also acted as a regional mediator, and they're regular Sunnis. So I'll stop there because we're running low on time, but would be very happy to follow up about some of these more sort of complex questions about the role of Muammar Gaddafi, for example, or Ba'athist or the secularists. And a lot of that is just, fits into some of these specific time periods that we're talking about.
Thanks for that answer and for that really great question, Michael. I just wanted to point out in the chat from Bill Hartung, seconds what you had to say on arms sales potentially from China, Russia, or even France, but makes a very important point on the issue of jobs. U.S. weapon sales to Saudis support approximately 20,000 or so jobs. That's out of 160 million people in the U.S. workforce. So we're talking about a fraction of 1%. And just to answer one more question from the chat briefly, let's see, Marcus asked, what is Raytheon's footprint in Yemen? Raytheon is not making any weapons in Yemen, but they do have a facility right in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. It's called Raytheon Arabia. And actually, we found out that during the Trump administration, in really an aberration, Raytheon was allowed to make high-tech bomb parts in a foreign country in Saudi Arabia, which is very concerning because then even if we decide we no longer want to sell high-tech bomb parts to Saudi Arabia, there's a threat of them now having this intellectual property. So Raytheon does not have any facilities in Yemen, but they are inextricably linked to the conflict in Yemen. And next, and I guess for our final question, I want to introduce the founder of the Raytheon anti-war campaign, Paul Shannon. Go ahead, the floor is yours, Paul.
Thanks, Brian. Dr. Sheline, thanks so much for spending your evening with us. This is very helpful and we really appreciate it. My understanding, just quickly, is that the Houthis are part of a broader coalition called Ansar Allah that includes many non-armed groups, and so that their political influence is broader than just the Houthi group itself. So I'd like you to quickly comment on that. But my frustration with what's going on is the big question for us is, how does this war end? And to understand how it might end, we have to understand what the different peace proposals from the various combatants actually are. And I have been unable to find out from any speakers so far, I don't know if this is fair to ask you, what is the position of Ansar Allah for how the war should end? So that we know whether it's reasonable, whether whether it can be promoted, if it's a realistic peace agreement. We know what the U.S. and Saudi agreement seems to be, which is to recognize the Hadi regime as the legitimate government, and everything else has to be built around that, which seems kind of ridiculous since that regime is not even in Yemen. So I just ask you what you know of what Ansar Allah and the Houthis are proposing as a way to end this terrible war.
Yeah, that's a very important question. And in general, it can unfortunately be a little hard to pin down because you do hear different things from various aspects of the movement. So just to clarify, the Houthis originally are a family group from the Saada region of northern Yemen. And Ansar Allah is their formal name for themselves, for the sort of broader movement. And so my understanding of what the Houthis are calling for, and again, this sort of shifts and depends on who you're talking to or which period of time we're looking at, but that initially they were saying they were in favor of some kind of shared political agreement, or some sort of power sharing arrangement, excuse me, knowing that they are unlikely to be able, or in fact, quite essentially impossible for the Houthis to control the entire territory of Yemen, but that they would like to be part of some kind of power sharing arrangement in the future. Very unlikely that the Houthis would be able to assert control over the former South Yemen, for example. Tribal dynamics there, they're not Zaidi, those are Sunni areas, and just partly having to do with the extent to which those local tribes are quite well armed and would just be unwilling to deal with control. And this is part of what we're seeing currently in Ma'arib as the Houthis are trying to take the strategically important city. You have tribes there who have always been somewhat resistant. And what I mean by always is because the Houthis detractors say that they would like to reimpose a system whereby essentially descendants of the Prophet Muhammad return to positions of political control. So this was the political system that was in place until 1952 when the Zaidi imamate was overthrown in a revolution. And eventually, after a civil war, the Republic of Yemen was established. Under those conditions of the Republic of Yemen, both prior to unification and then following unification of North and South Yemen, you have had the political elite has continued to be Zaidi. All five presidents of Yemen were Zaidi up until Hadi, who's from the south originally, who was Sunni. But it wasn't leadership was not dependent on descent from the Prophet Muhammad, which the Houthi family has. And so again, it depends who you talk to and when you talk to them. And so the concern by people who reject Houthi control is they say those Houthis just want to take us back to the time of the Zaydi Imamate, where political control is just dependent on this sort of inherited status of the second Prophet Muhammad. And we don't want that. We want a system of democracy and meritocracy where you vote on who is your political leader. Houthi supporters would argue, well, we want that too. We don't necessarily want to go back to a system of Houthi supremacy. There are people who lost out in kind of the interim period of the Yemeni Republic. It has been, certain tribes have done better under this system, certain people have done better, and others who used to do well have done less well. And so this is part of why we're continuing to see just such a jostling for power in Yemen, because there's an awareness of the stakes here, that the political system that had been in place up until the 1960s was really quite radically transformed by that revolution, as revolutions tend to do. And so the argument is that the Houthis would like to go back to that system. But then you have some members of the Houthi movement, or of the Ansarullah movement, who say, no, we would support some kind of power sharing agreement, and we don't want to go back to necessarily the supremacy of the Saad, the Sayyid class of the descendants. So that it's not a super satisfactory answer, but I think you do tend to hear different things depending on who you're talking to, and also just how sort of optimistic the Houthis are feeling about their chances. I mean, you have heard statements from the Houthis about, Ma'rib tomorrow and Jerusalem the next week. The Houthis have managed to achieve far more as a result of violence than they ever thought possible. And so this, again, is part of why it is very important that Biden push for a more realistic peace agreement, because under the current terms, the Houthis are never going to come to the negotiating table. Biden has to give them some kind of incentive to agree to negotiate. And again, because they feel they have this momentum and they've been winning through violence, it's going to take a really powerful incentive to get them to put down their weapons.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, and thanks for spending so much time with us tonight, Dr. Sheline. I think what you laid out is that it's a complicated political situation in Yemen, and I guess one simple and satisfying thing that we can say about it is that we don't feel that it's the United States' job to determine the future of Yemen. It is not our place as foreign interveners and supporters and suppliers of weapons to put our thumb on the scale. That creates resentment, and it's has very, very little chance of supporting peace in the future. So we press for just to be clear. We do not support any one faction in the Yemeni civil war. What we do support is the United States not being involved in this conflict, which is unconstitutional, which has not been authorized by Congress, and really implicates us in some horrible war crimes and a humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen. Just one final brief question, and that's a really easy one. How can people support your work, follow your work? Where can people find your writings? And is there anything that you're working on right now that you'd like the audience to know about?
Thanks. Yeah. So if you're on Twitter, my Twitter handle is Annelle Sheline, just first name, last name. If you're interested in following the work of the Quincy Institute, so we are a DC-based think tank trying to reduce US militarism, essentially arguing that the United States should use diplomacy. We should use other foreign policy tools and not turn to the military as sort of our primary tool for pursuing our goals around the world. I focus on the Middle East, but we also have a strong East Asia team trying to prevent this sort of drumbeat towards a new Cold War with China. If you're interested in that, you go to our website, quincyinst.org. I can put that in the chat.
Yep, and we'll include it in the follow-up email as well. So
Perfect.
Don't worry about saving the chat, everyone. You'll get it in your inbox too.
Perfect. We have a weekly newsletter where you can kind of follow us, or we're also active on Twitter. Although I know a lot of intelligent people are not on Twitter because Twitter, it's can be a big time suck. But in general, at the moment, a big project that I'm working on is to try to support this effort by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's force posture review. We've had some encouraging statements from people like Adam Smith, Representative Adam Smith, the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, affirming the fact that the United States should no longer try to pursue military supremacy as our goal, that we should really focus on the American people. And to do that, we need to do things like focus on climate change, for example, and not try to continue to dominate the world. So the exciting thing is that we are seeing some support in this administration for these kinds of goals, but that they need more political cover. And so I think the main thing I would ask is, so if, definitely reach out to your representatives about Yemen, but also just in general, to support things like a reduced force posture abroad. That in general, we know that the American public is really tired of the forever wars, but in Washington, D.C., there continues to be this blob consensus that the United States should just continue to try to exert our military power all over the world. And we know that the reason that happens is because of special interests and the military industrial complex. And so the way to push back against that is for our political representatives to hear from us, rejecting overt militarism. So if Yemen's your issue, definitely a lot of actions to be taken on Yemen, but if there are other parts of the world that you're especially passionate about, it is crucial that the United States, under this administration, that the administration understands that the American people really are sick and tired of American militarism.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And even to bolster that, I just saw a poll of military veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. And by some polls, they oppose continuing the war in Afghanistan and our remaining presence in Iraq at even higher levels than the general public. So there's a lot of support by people who know a thing or two for ending these forever wars. It's not only a huge drain on our economy, our ability to protect ourselves from climate change and pandemics, it's also really a disservice to members of our armed forces to put them in forever wars that don't have clear victory conditions, and that can cause a lot of harm to them as well, mental and physical, for the rest of their lives. So, this is about supporting members of the armed services too. So don't worry if you didn't get all those links that we just mentioned, ways to sign on as an organization or just as an individual to support war powers. Copies of Dr. Sheline's article and some of the key links will be included in a follow-up email to everyone who registered. We do encourage you, please, to share the recording with all your friends and family, get the word out on this issue. And we thank you for joining us. Couldn't do this without an audience, but we do appreciate involvement more than anything else. We are Massachusetts Peace Action, accent on the action, I would say. So please, whatever you do, get involved in some way. A great way to get involved would be to attend our organizing meeting on Monday, July 12th at 5 p.m. you can plan events just like the great talk that we had with Dr. Sheline tonight. And also, find out how you can oppose the war industry in Massachusetts directly. These issues seem like they're on the other side of the world, but has a lot to do with what's going on right here in Massachusetts. So please get involved. We invite you to become a member of Massachusetts Peace Action. And if you can, please consider donating a couple of dollars because we will always keep our webinars and educational programs free, and we rely on your support. So I want to really thank Dr. Sheline for giving us so much of her time and sharing her expertise. And we hope to have you again. And hopefully we'll be talking about the end of the war in Yemen.
Thanks so much for having me. I wanted to highlight what Hayat had said about this is not only about what's in the best interest of Americans, but obviously in the interest of people around the world who've been subjected to American violence. So really appreciate all the important work that you are doing on that front, and everyone to listening. I know if you're tuning in, it's because you know how important these issues are.
Well, thank you for arming us with information. It's going to help us in our advocacy, and Hayat, thank you for that great note. That's really important. This is about multilateralism and, really about a fellowship with all of our brothers and sisters across the world. So let's do it together, and thank you for being with us. And we'll see you all on July 12th at the organizing meeting. Let's end this war in Yemen. Have a great night.